Hey, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here today with former Senator Doug Jones of Alabama, who was also the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama, who prosecuted two KKK members for the bombing of the 16th Street Church in 1963. And since today is the anniversary of that bombing, it seemed like it would be a good opportunity to hear more about what happened, how the prosecution came about, and ultimately why that matters. So thank you so much for being here, Senator.
Heather, it's great to be with you. I'm like so many millions of Americans. I wake up with you every morning, so it's great to see you live.
Well, it's so much fun to do this because we're actually figuring out why the history matters.
Yes.
So, for a lot of people who don't remember this bombing, could you tell us really quickly what happened?
Sure. Birmingham was, as Dr. King said, the most segregated city in America at the time, in the late 50s, early 60s. There had been a lot of bombings. It was a violent city for racial incident, attacks on the Black neighborhoods. Birmingham became known as Bombingham. There were so many bombs that were being exploded in the area in North Birmingham. So now became known as Dynamite Hill. And it was pretty tense in Birmingham in 1963 in particular. Birmingham form of government had just changed. There was a school desegregation case that was working its way through federal courts, and most people were assuming that likely federal courts would order the integration of schools. So Birmingham was very tense in the spring, and Dr. King came to Birmingham in the spring of 1963. That's where you've seen what has become known the children's marches. And it was the kids who took to the street, and our racist police commissioner, Bull Connor, met them with fire hoses and dogs. Most of your folks have seen or studied all of those films and seen the photographs. And when that happened, though, when they ended those marches, it was as if a bullseye was put on the church and the children of Birmingham in the late spring, May of 1963. George Wallace stands in the schoolhouse door a month later. Medgar Evers is killed that same day, as a matter of fact. The I Have a Dream speech, though, brought hope in the air. But in Birmingham, the schools were about to be desegregated. The courts had ordered it. Just 5 days before this bombing, the schools of Birmingham were integrated for the first time. So Birmingham was on end, and that's what prompted this bombing placed outside the church. It was going to be a youth worship service, and 4 kids were killed that were getting ready for that youth worship service.
So, can you go back a little bit and explain why it was the children and why it was that particular church? Because a lot of people, I suspect, don't recognize, first of all, why people in Birmingham turn to the children. And second of all, that church is actually in the background of most of the images of Bull Connor and his officers attacking the children with fire hoses, for example.
Yeah, that church was the most prominent African-American church in the city at the time. There were a lot of churches. We're in the Bible Belt. There's a lot of churches, but that was the most prominent. And it was just a few blocks from City Hall, right on the edge of what is called downtown Birmingham. And the church was used as a meetings place for the civil rights movement. Everybody would come to that church at one point or another. Dr. King, Reverend Shuttlesworth, even Jackie Robinson came and spoke at that church. And the way this worked with the kids is that this had been planned, but all of a sudden, as they got into the marches early on, when Dr. King, for instance, gets arrested, they realized that so many of the adults in Birmingham really couldn't leave their jobs that they had. They couldn't leave as domestic help or in the factories. And so they had the idea that it would be the children, and children and when I say children, it was mainly teenagers and college students that would empty out of their classrooms and come down, because that's how they would get the most effect. And it played right into the hands of Bull Connor. I mean, he could not control himself. And that is when they would meet at the church. That's why I said that the children in the church had a target on their back, because they met at the church left to simply walk to City Hall for freedom. And right outside of that church, Bull Connor didn't let them get very far into Kelly Ingram Park, into the streets. That's when fire hoses and dogs just started. The films are amazing. I mean, there are films that of bull Connor and fire hoses, and it's almost like the firemen were pressure washing the sidewalks, kids just rolling up the sidewalk due to the pressure. But that's why it became a target. That church was the place for the mass meetings that occurred in Birmingham, and the children were the focal point of the movement, not just that spring, but later in the fall when it was the kids who were integrating the schools.
Right. So the kids become the target. And what happened on that day?
That Sunday morning, it was a Sunday morning as usual, but Reverend Cross had advertised on the marquee outside the church it was going to be a youth worship service. He wanted, as the kids were going back to school, to have a monthly service in which the youth of Birmingham were going to conduct the entire service. He wanted those kids to come back to that church, not for civil rights, but for faith, where churches are. And that was, so the marquee outside did that. And that's what was going on. These 4 young girls, and it was actually 5, in the ladies' lounge in the basement of that church, were there getting ready between Sunday school and church for the youth worship service. They were all going to participate. And they were down in that basement, and the ladies' lounge had backed up. It was on the wall. There was a big window there that went to the street. And that's where the bomb was placed, just outside that window where these children were. So that ladies' lounge took the brunt of a very powerful bomb.
So a bomb was placed there, goes off in the morning. What happens in the aftermath of that?
It was bedlam around there for a while. You can imagine the church was filled with Sunday school goers, and the adult Sunday school classes were actually meeting in the sanctuary upstairs, including Denise McNair's mother, who was in the choir loft almost directly above where the ladies' lounge was in the church. And there were about 20 something people upstairs that were injured through flying glass and those kind of things. But the FBI came in immediately. I mean, look, the FBI catches a lot of grief because people don't like J. Edgar Hoover, and they don't think he investigated the case appropriately. He really did. He sunk a ton of resources into this. So FBI was on the scene quickly, trying to go through the debris, trying to find what they could to try to rebuild this bomb, get whatever clues that they could. The thing that was interesting to me in looking back at the files, and Bill Baxley, who prosecuted the case in 1977, found the same thing, was that Birmingham police and some of the state police were sifting through and trying to do investigations to try to prove that some members of the Black community bombed the church in order to get sympathy for the civil rights case, for their civil rights cause. But the fact is, the FBI came in, they started interviewing people. The Klan, though, clammed up. It was their code of silence, and they could not break through that code of silence. And there was not any kind of physical evidence that we could link at that time to anybody.
So there are no prosecutions in the immediate aftermath of the bombing?
None. And in 1968, the federal government closed the file. I even didn't really fully appreciate this, but the statute of limitations for a civil rights case in 1963, a federal statute of limitations, even when a death occurred, was only 5 years. And so J. Edgar Hoover closed the file without any prosecution. In hindsight, I can't fault him for that because I don't know if they could have gotten one. He never did talk to the U.S. Attorney's Office, which I think was a mistake. But they closed the file, and it was not until 1970 with a young district attorney named Bill Baxley was elected Attorney General of the state of Alabama. He had been in law school when it happened, and he reopened the case. And that led ultimately to the first prosecution of what is commonly referred to as the ringleader, Dynamite Bob Chambliss, in 1977. He was convicted by Baxley's team, went to prison, died in prison in the early 80s. All of the files remained in Birmingham. It was technically still, I won't say, it was open but not active. I'll put it that way. Because after 5 years, there could be no prosecutions. What happened with us, and truly what happened with Baxley prosecuted Chambliss in state court. where there is no statute of limitations. He had trouble getting the documents from the FBI, and there's a whole long story about that before he finally got enough that would assist him. I obviously didn't have that problem when I was a U.S. attorney 20 something years later. But even then, Heather, ultimately, we had to move the case over to state court. I was a U.S. attorney, but I got designated as a deputy attorney general for the state of Alabama to prosecute these two guys, Tommy Blanton and Bobby Frank Cherry, for the murder of those four little girls because there was no statute of limitations.
So I'm going to step back just a second here. How did you come onto the scene and find that you were going to be the prosecutor of these murders? And why was it so important to you? Because I've certainly heard you talk about it before.
Well, I think there's a number of reasons that it was important to me, including the fact, candidly, and this sounds trite, but I was sworn to uphold the law. I was sworn as a prosecutor. It was my job that if there was evidence that we should right this wrong. I mean, the fact of the matter is the justice system let these families down, let this community down, let this state down, let the country down by not being able to bring these killers to justice. But on a personal level, it kind of goes back too. I mean, I was only 9 when the bomb exploded. And so I watched the changes from Jim Crow into the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the changes of school integration and integration of the races into society. And this was always a stain on Birmingham. And I knew it was a stain on Birmingham. And I felt like if we had to do this, that if we needed to do it, we needed to do it then because time was passing. There had been a couple of cases in Mississippi that had been successful, that got everybody optimistic that we could go back and seek this truth and seek this justice. But I also thought it was really important to make sure that the community knows we're just not going to let perpetrators get away with murder and just close the books unless we have to, and not ever, in light of evidence or new circumstances, go after someone who has committed such a horrendous crime. I think that's really important then, and I think it's still important today.
So you found some new evidence, did you not?
Well, it was interesting because the two cases we ultimately wanted to try both Blanton and Cherry together, but ultimately we had to separate the two because of some mental issues that Cherry raised about his ability to stand trial. And the cases were very different. The Blanton case was primarily with evidence that existed at the time, but that the government probably couldn't have used at the time. They could have, but there were tape recordings of an informant. There was a tape recording with a bug, electronic surveillance that was placed in Blanton's apartment. All of that was evidence that perhaps could not have been used. Not that it was seized illegally, but the law was just different at the time. And there was also a witness that we had that we were able to convince to testify. He wouldn't testify when Baxley tried Chambliss. And he was, by the time we got to him, he was an elderly black man. He was a retired postal worker. He had seen Chambliss and Blanton at the church about 2 weeks before at 1 o'clock in the morning. It was pretty clear what they were about to do then. He was scared. He didn't want to testify in Baxley's case, but we were able to convince him. So that was a little bit new. We had an informant who probably wouldn't have testified in the 60s that was ready to testify now. So it was old evidence that just got packaged differently and was able to do. The Cherry case, the newest evidence that we had in Cherry was admissions that he had made over the years. He got pretty comfortable that the government was not going to come after him. He moved to Texas, and he, over the years at different times, made some admissions. He made admissions to his family. He made it, and his granddaughter was one of our witnesses. He made admissions to people he was working with in Texas in 1980. And over the years, and those people came forward when they saw it on television. So that was the gist of the new evidence. And again, piecing the other pieces together in just a different way and knowing that we could use those tape recordings was a big plus for us, because I'm not sure that even Baxley could have used those if he had them.
So I have heard you say in different interviews that there were many times in which you felt that you were, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that you were following a path that was set out for you.
It just seemed like that. It is felt that way for a long time, including the fact that, when the first of these church bombing cases was tried in 1977, I was a second-year law student here in Birmingham, and I wanted to be a trial lawyer. And just a couple of years before, when I was in college at the University of Alabama, the law school had brought Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas to speak. And he was an amazing justice. And it was the 20th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. And I not only heard his talk, but I got to spend the day with him because he happened to be of the same fraternity at Whitman that I was at Alabama. And he came by the fraternity house. It was a really incredible day. I flew back with him on the university plane to Atlanta so he could catch his plane to Washington. And he told me if I wanted to be a trial lawyer to go watch good trials, or watch good lawyers do what they do best. And I did that in the Baxley case. I cut classes to watch Baxley try Chambliss. And it was one of the most remarkable scenes. I was in the balcony watching Bill give this incredible closing argument. I talked to him briefly afterwards, and it had an impact on you. And I never dreamed in my wildest imagination that 24 years later, I would pick up where Bill left off. Others didn't do it. There were a couple opportunities, but others passed on it. And we picked that up, and I tried Blanton in the same courtroom where I watched as a kid. So, yeah, there's an interesting path. And that bombing, and I tell this to lawyers all the time, I'm going to do this later in the week to a bar association in Florida. It really does change you. It really changes you as a lawyer. It changes you as a person to understand and know what people do in the name of hate, how we can combat it, and that everybody is here for a purpose and everybody should have equal opportunities. I keep thinking of those little girls, Heather, and what they might have been had they been able to grow up.
And wasn't there a birthday that jumped out at you at one point?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. When Bill tried his case, I was in the balcony watching his closing argument. And he gave his argument on a day in November, his closing argument to convince the jury to convict Robert Chambliss. He did it on a day that would have been Denise McNair's 27th birthday, I think. And he formulated at the last minute his whole closing argument about that, about giving Denise a present that she hadn't had for 14 years. And that's justice, bringing her killer to justice. And there wasn't a dry in the house. I mean, it was powerful. It sounds almost corny to just talk about it like this, but it was a powerful moment. As we started the Blanton case, we got to looking because we'd read all the transcripts from Bill's trials, and we got to looking and we did our opening statement. And I called my first witness, who was the mother of Carol Robertson, Miss Robertson. I called her as one of my very first witnesses on a day that would have been Carol's 51st birthday. Mm-hmm. And to see that mother testifying about the death of her child some 37 years earlier, it sets the tone. I mean, it really sets the tone for the jury. And I wanted to make sure that jury knew that these cases were not simply about history. They were about victims, because that's really at the end of the day who we were trying this case for, the victims and their families, which includes and the community.
Well, that brings up my next question. Why prosecute cases that are this old? I mean, there's a lot of people who argue that in fact you should let the past lie in the past and let the perpetrators dissolve into oblivion.
Yeah, look, we heard a little bit of that. I think we've probably heard a little bit more than most in older cases, primarily because people in Birmingham are so sensitive to what happened here in the civil rights movement and the fire hoses and the dogs, and they think we've moved on. I'm not, and we have to a great extent, not as far as I think people think, but we have moved on a lot. I think the country has. But at the end of the day, these laws are there for a reason. And if you're going to respect the rule of law, you follow the evidence and you follow the trail and you go wherever it leads. And I think people have to have and not just victims, I think the community as a whole has to have that sense of comfort knowing that their law enforcement and their prosecutors and all will do what they can to make sure that anyone who commits a crime in this country is brought to justice. Can't always do it. There's a lot of unsolved cases out there, but you can't shy away simply because the defendant is elderly. You can't shy away because the defendant is a powerful person. You can't shy away simply because the person may be of a different race or religion. You've got to go where the evidence leads. And I think respect for the law and the rule of law and our jury system like that, and the duty that I was sworn to uphold when I became the United States Attorney is pretty powerful. There was an interesting historical event that occurred in the middle of these investigations. We had to split the cases, as I mentioned a minute ago, and we started the Blanton case in May of 2001. And I remember, and I use these words very specifically. I used them intentionally. And I told the jury in that opening statement as I was setting the stage of Birmingham in 1963, that what happened on that Sunday morning was an act of terrorism, long before the word terrorist and terrorism became so common in our language. We had heard those mainly conservative talk radio saying you shouldn't go after, these are just old guys. Well, if you recall, Heather, just about 3 months later, September 11th, 2001, Twin Towers in New York come down, the Pentagon is hit, and a plane that was hijacked was brought down in a field in Pennsylvania. And America changed at that point. And the other thing that changed here, we still had the Cherry case pending, and nobody was saying, well, he's just an old terrorist, don't go after him. People, it hit home that especially in a case like that, with perpetrators you knew are probably not homegrown, that you're going to have to chase around the world, it might take a long time for them to be brought to justice. But there is nobody ever going to say, don't do it. It didn't matter how long it took. People were going to want that to happen. Well, these families in Birmingham deserve the same kind of quest for justice that the 9/11 victims did. And we felt very strongly about that. And we had some troubles in Cherry, but we were able to overcome them and try him about 6 months later and convict him as well. But I think that just shows you can't pick and choose. You've got to seek justice whenever you have the opportunity to seek justice. And remember, justice is also a search for the truth.
So did that conviction of Cherry close the book for you?
Not for me. It didn't close the book for me. It closed the book on prosecutions of the church bombing. We had always believed that there were others who at least knew what was going on and helped cover it up. But it appeared that most all of those people had passed on earlier. Certainly the one or two people that we thought might have been involved had died. So it closed the books for the prosecutions, but it opened other doors for me, including the many, many, many times that I have given presentations about those cases around the country, both by myself or on occasion with Bill Baxley, who prosecuted the Chambliss case in '77. And it let people see all that. It reminded people of what was going on. It reminded folks of a time in this country where racial tensions were causing deaths and destruction, and that we don't want to make those same mistakes. It gave me an opportunity to educate a lot of folks that I don't think had been appropriately educated about the civil rights movement and the sacrifices. They'd heard about Martin Luther King's death, but there were so many other people that sacrificed with both their lives and their bodies over the time. So that opened up, I think, a lot for me to be able to talk about that. And it was the kind of thing that I think would help people in Birmingham heal a little bit. You know, I tell folks, everybody, people would use the term, it brought closure. And I said, no, you never want to close that. You never want to forget about it and close it up. Did it put some salve on open wounds? Absolutely. Did it help heal those wounds? Absolutely. And there's a lot of wounds still out there, Heather. And the reason I like to still talk about that case now is because I think we're backsliding. We're seeing more hate crimes. We have over the last few years. I think the racial polarization is getting stronger than it was, and it's broader. It's not just black on white. It involves any manner of races and religions these days. So I think it's important to remember the mistakes of the past so that we don't go back and commit them again.
Well, what really jumps out in this moment today in America in 2025 is the violence that turned Birmingham into, as you say, Bombingham. Are there lessons in that event today for Americans, do you think? What should we take away from this?
Oh, absolutely. I'm really, I'm so glad you asked that, because especially after the events of last week, because I've said all along, and people understood all along, that there is a direct connection between the church bombing and the deaths of those children, the death of Emmett Till, the death, others of the Medgar Evers over in Mississippi and Vernon Dahmer in Mississippi. There's a direct connection between that and the rhetoric, the dog whistle politics of Southern segregationists like George Wallace and Bull Connor and Ross Barnett in Mississippi and others, because they use those same kind of dog whistles that wasn't going out and saying, we need to kill people, we need to bomb people, they didn't do that. But 2 weeks before the church bombing, George Wallace was famously quoted as saying, well, in order to stop integration, we need to have a few first-class funerals. Well, there is people that are hearing that from a governor, someone in authority, and Bull Connor was just as bad, if not worse. There are people hearing that saying, okay, he is basically telling us, he's giving us permission. They are creating this permission structure to go out and do these evil deeds, thinking that they will somehow get away with it. And there's an incredible number of parallels in that today. And it started several years ago when a presidential candidate was telling supporters to beat up anybody that was heckling him. He wasn't telling people to kill folks, but he was beginning to give a permission structure for violence. And what I don't think folks fully appreciate is that that violence begets violence, and it doesn't have to all come from one side. When violence starts and political violence starts, it's going to bleed over to both sides, and there are going to be victims on both sides of the political aisle. And that's exactly what we have seen over the last few years in what is, I believe, an alarming amount of political violence in this country that is directly related to some of the rhetoric we're hearing, whether it's dehumanizing individuals, whether it's calling your opponents names that's such that gets people riled up. Folks, there are people that don't have normal ears when they hear things like that, and they're hearing a permission structure. And I think we've seen that play out, whether it was most recently with the assassin of Charlie Kirk, the assassination in Minnesota, the attempt on then candidate Trump's life, Gabby Giffords, Steve Scalise, you name it. I mean, it just seems to be a more and more than it harkens me back to 1968 when we lost both Senator Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King in a span of about 3 months.
So, can you look back at that period and suggest ways that people can combat that kind of polarization and rhetoric and the violence that comes from it?
Well, I think it takes a little courage. Okay, I think which quite frankly, I think it takes courage. I would love to see courage with the halls of Congress. I was on a program with someone in literally in the moments in a couple of hours after the Kirk shooting in Utah the other day, and I got asked, what would I do if I was in the Senate at this point? And I thought back to what happened in Washington, D.C. after 9/11, where members of the House and the Senate all came together and they walked down on the steps of the Capitol and they were one singing "God Bless America." And I told him, I said, I think I would try to reach out and say, look, it's time that we go and do something on the steps of the Capitol. This is an attack on America. Let's go talk about it, but let's not just condemn violence. Let's condemn the rhetoric, and let's try to get everybody doing a little introspection about their own language. Could it be seen in a different way? Can I say things in ways to get my point across, my political point across, without demeaning people, without creating a situation that might put their life in jeopardy? And I think that we need that, number one. Number two is I think we ought to have people calling folks out. Folks not just on Substack and recordings like this, but calling people out, on the radio, that everybody's got to tone down. And we can't have just Democrats pointing fingers at Republicans, or Republicans pointing fingers at Democrats, like quite a few have done the last few days. Everybody needs to be looking inside, but we've got to get the people. I still believe ultimately the power in all of this is with the people, that they need to start demanding of their folks that we need to live in a safer society than this. And that's everyone's responsibility.
Well, amen to that. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for your work throughout your career, both in the law and in the Senate. And we look forward to seeing what you do next. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Heather. It's been great to be with you.